"Please, just make it quick," she whispered, a shocking ending in true Wild West stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. In Red Creek, a girl once stood on a wooden scaffold and asked for it to be quick. Nobody answered, except a farmhand who dropped a silver dollar. From that silence, another story began, one about decency hard enough to make someone lift their head toward daylight. She was put out like stock, and all she said was, "Please, just make it quick." Wind came off the pale ridges and pushed red dust through the warped eaves of Red Creek. At noon, the sun hung like a hot coin, baking the square until the board split. In the center stood a rough scaffold, tall enough to see plain, low enough the crowd didn't need to look up. It was where folks traded reins, posts, a few lean cattle on market days. Today, a rope was already waiting on the beam. Sarah stood on the platform, eyes down, wrists folded in front of her. Her dress, once pale blue, was mud-stained and torn at the hem. Sun had burned lines across her collarbone, down her thin shoulders like cracks in dry riverbeds. The air carried smoke from far off, mixed with sweat, old leather, and rusted iron. A few men shifted their hats, looking her over like a saddle left too long without oil. Women edged their children aside, not out of fear, but out of habit, keeping their shoes clear of dirt. A fly touched her hand and left. Boots tapped the boards. No one raised their voice. They didn't have to. In Red Creek, a thing like this spoke for itself, in the shadow thrown by the scaffold, in the way the dust stopped for a second in the air before falling. Sarah drew in a breath, shallow. Her chest was dry enough that the air rasped. She counted in her head, where the seams of her dress had split, which heel of her shoes had worn thin, whether the bruise on her wrist was still purple or turning yellow. Once, washing her hair at the trough, she would hide it under a cloth so the neighbor boys wouldn't stare. Today, she had no hand free to pull anything over. She searched for no one in the crowd. There were no friends there, and if there were, they were only backs turned away. On the post, a wooden tag swung loose, carved letters, rough. The blade long dulled. The wind knocked it against the beam. A dry clack. It sounded like a spoon against the rim of a pot in some kitchen. Nothing worth notice, yet it carried. Sarah fixed on that clacking to drown the other sounds. A throat cleared, a short laugh, the drag of lips over dry teeth. Her feet were bare, soles pressed into hot dust. A loose thread from her hem brushed her ankle now and then, proof her skin still felt. For a moment, a cloud passed over the sun. Heat eased for the length of one heartbeat. Dust in the air seemed to stop, hanging bright like pale ash. Sarah raised her head a little, not to see anyone, but to catch that scrap of sky above the saloon roof, round like the eye of a horse taking its first saddle. Then the light came back, harsher, pushing her into the present like a hand at her back. She felt her tongue dry against the roof of her mouth. When her voice finally came out, it didn't reach the crowd. It dropped at her boots, small enough that a man would have to lean in to hear. "Please, just make it quick." The words snapped off like a broken thread, not a cry for help. They carried no hope of change, only the wish that time, always moving steady as a horse on a worn trail, wouldn't drag more dust across her face. At the edge of the square, a dog lay with its chin on the ground, eyes half open. It flicked its tail once, then went still. Wind pushed the little flags outside the mercantile, making a rustle like new cloth unwashed. A metal bucket, left on a step, rolled one notch and stopped. All those small things came together into a quiet backdrop, pushing her whisper farther away inside its own smallness. Sarah's throat burned. She thought of the wooden basin behind the house, water drawn up from the well, carrying a faint taste of iron, cold enough to numb her fingertips in the morning. She thought of the cloth hanging on the line, drops still clinging to its edge. She thought of the kitchen door creaking when the wind turned. None of that was here. Here, there was only the scaffold and the dust. Here, they needed her to stand straight, silent, so the work could be done like any other task of the day, like shoeing a horse, like weighing out corn. Someone in the crowd cleared his throat, then laughed. The laugh didn't travel far. It struck the post and dropped, landing beside the worn carving. Sarah felt her shoulders draw in as if to keep some part of herself from being exposed to their eyes. She bowed lower, letting her hair cover half her face. Her hands pressed tight together, knuckles gone white. Across the back of her hand ran an old scar, the cut from a shard of glass when she washed a salt jar years ago. The memory didn't make her stronger. It only reminded her she had once belonged in a kitchen, not on display as goods. Another wind came through, stronger. It knocked the wooden tag against the post 3 times, even and dry. Outside the town, a cow's bellow carried in, dragging with it the smell of burned grass from far off. Sarah closed her eyes once, the way a person does before bending to lift a heavy load. Only this weight had no shape, no handle. It was the eyes of others pressing on her skin, the way her name had been stripped from the mouths that once called it. When she opened her eyes, the world was the same. Scaffold, post, rope, dust, faces without names, wide brims, streaked white, where sweat had dried to salt. A child peeked out from behind a man's trouser leg, curious for a beat, then yanked back out of sight. Someone tugged at a sleeve, someone stepped on his own shadow. A sliver of sunlight lay across the back of her hand, warm to the point of cruelty. Sarah did not cry. In Red Creek, tears burned off quick as water in a pan. She only stood, listening to her heart stumble once, then settle back into its slow pace. The whisper had fallen and stayed where it landed. Someday, maybe, the wind would take it, snag it on a root, scatter it into dust. For now, it was the only thing that belonged to her, a small, ordinary wish. Not for justice, not for return, just that the ending wouldn't drag on. Above, a hawk wheeled, its shadow sliding over the square, like the sky letting out a sigh. And Red Creek, in all its practiced indifference, stood still, as if what was happening were only another turn in the weather. In the middle of that dry picture, a girl kept her back straight, eyes fixed on no one, and a whisper, thin as falling dust. Please, just make it quick. In Red Creek, the wicked weren't as frightening as the crowd that turned its back, indifferent to a person's shame. Red Creek was never loud. It had only one main street, running from the water dock to the square, laid with thin planks that had creaked for years. On either side stood rows of tin-roofed wooden houses, shutters half closed, walls leaning. That noon, the wind wouldn't quit, driving red dust across the saloon porch, slipping through the gaps of the smithy's door, scattering cold cinders across the ground. Men gathered outside the saloon, leaning against posts, holding mugs of flat beer, eyes narrowed against the sun, yet still carrying curiosity. They didn't talk about the auction going on in the square. That was nothing strange, nothing worth wasting words. They talked about sick horses, about last month's rain that hadn't been enough to beat down the dust, about the price of salt climbing again. Now and then, one of them glanced over, eyes as cold as a knife left on a fishmonger's table. Then he looked away, as if staring too long might be more trouble than it was worth. Women carried their children hurrying across the square, cloaks pulled to hide half their faces. No one wanted their child's eyes to catch the sight of the scaffold standing there. A few kids played in the dirt by the road, but when their mothers called sharp, they slipped away quick, leaving their games behind. There were no shouts, no protests. It went on like part of the market day, sellers weighing, buyers bargaining, and the crowd silent, accepting. The barrier, holding it all together, wasn't a stretched rope, wasn't the gun at someone's hip. It was thicker, harder to see. Indifference built over years. In Red Creek, folks learned to turn their faces away to keep the peace, as if there was an unspoken law. What doesn't touch your house doesn't belong to you. And so, every time they looked away, someone else's shame packed down another layer of dirt underfoot, sealing silence into the town's post. Hoofbeats echoed faint from a distance, mixed with the creak of an old hinge at the mercantile. A man coughed, spat into the dust, then sat still as if nothing had happened. On the saloon porch, a tin sign rattled in the wind, its long screech like background music for indifference. In the center of the square, Sarah still stood, thin frame swallowed up in the weight of eyes that would not meet hers. Each glance turned away was another door shutting, leaving her exposed in an emptiness that kept growing. That crowd was not evil, but their silence was the strongest wall, a wall invisible, high enough that her frail whisper could never climb past it. And Red Creek, in that noon of red dust, chose to stand still. No protest, no hand reaching out, only indifference, heavier than stone on a girl's shoulders. The farmer at the edge of the square hadn't come to save anyone, but in his eyes, old memories stirred. At the edge of the square, where an old birch still carried enough leaves to throw a few patches of shade, Jonas sat quiet. He didn't push to the front, didn't join the crowd. His wide brim hat was pulled low, cutting his face in half, so only the square jaw remained, carved hard by sun and wind. His coat was worn thin, its earth-colored cloth faded, boots coated with dust that hadn't seen a brush in months. Jonas hadn't come out of curiosity, nor to watch. Folks said he sat like that at every market, at the saloon, even in church on Sunday mornings, silent, spare with words, eyes carrying a darkness like the mountain ridge in the distance. Those who knew his story understood. He'd once had a little girl, hair bright as the last sun of the day. She fell sick, then worse. When medicine was needed, he had only a few coins and a handful of dried corn. The town doctor demanded payment up front. He didn't have enough. The girl died in the wooden shack while the winter wind still creaked through the roof, and from then on, there was a hollow in Jonas's eyes that never closed. When he saw Sarah standing on the scaffold, arms limp, eyes scattered as if they'd already left her body, that hollow rang again. He didn't see a girl put up like merchandise. He saw his child the last time her small hand clutched his finger, eyes sinking deep, no light left to hold on to life. Jonas's hand closed tight, veins standing on the back. He stayed put, said nothing. The town was used to silence, and he had learned how to live inside it. But in his chest, Sarah's shape worked like a mirror, throwing back everything he'd once failed. His daughter's death, the poverty that bent his head, the silence that cost him everything. No one paid Jonas any mind. They were used to him as a shadow slipping through the market, a man burned out. But right then, on the edge of the square, an invisible cord pulled his eyes to the thin figure on the scaffold, and in his chest rose a beat out of step. Not pity, not duty, only memory, too close, too sharp, refusing to let him turn away again. Just a worn coin and an old coat. Sometimes humanity lives in the smallest act. That auction carried no shouting, no raised hands fighting over bids. It dragged along like a play repeated too many times, until both actors and watchers grew tired. The man running it stood on the platform, voice rasped, calling out numbers, but no answer came. Only the wind cut across, swirling dust around boots, filling the gaps between his words. Sarah stood with her eyes down. Each number called seemed to fold her smaller, as if her body shrank with every price. But silence weighed heavier. No one cared to bid, no one bothered to lift a hand, as if she wasn't worth a scrawny calf or a saddle worn bare. A few dry chuckles came from the corner of the saloon, brittle as split wood. Then another sound, metal against wood, soft but sharp. A coin set down on the edge of the platform. No high call, no firm hand raised, only a sun-darkened, sinewed hand letting fall a silver piece worn flat. Jonas said nothing. He only rose, stepping out of the shade so the sunlight struck across his weathered face. The crowd stirred for a moment. Someone snorted, someone spat in the dust. A single coin for a human being, a cheap joke. But no one said more. No one stepped in. There was no need. A man like Jonas, a girl like Sarah, what other ending could there be? The auctioneer gave a careless nod, hand flicking as if to swat a fly. Done. It all happened so quick. It was as though nothing had taken place at all. But Sarah felt the rope slip from her wrist, a hand giving her a light shove down. Her legs shook, missing a step. Jonas didn't reach out to catch her. He only pulled off his old coat, shoulders frayed, and set it slow across her back. The gesture was unhurried, free of judgment. The coat hung too large, covering most of her thin frame. Sarah bowed her head slightly, fingers gripping the edge, as if, for the first time in months, something had touched her skin without leaving a bruise. The crowd thinned, same as after any market day. A horse's whinny, hooves knocking the boards, the saloon doors banging together. No one looked back. Only red dust, hard sun, and a silent man walking on, beside a girl wrapped in a coat too big. No words were spoken, but in that moment, something else had been set down. Not the coin, but a piece of humanity Red Creek had long forgotten. In the poor kitchen, silence was no longer a shackle, but a place to breathe. Jonas's house sat nearly an hour's ride from town. The road to it cut across dry prairie. Grass burned yellow in patches like long scars. At the bottom of a slope, the low wooden house came into view, quiet in the field, much like the man who lived in it, plain, without display, without promise. When Sarah stepped onto the porch, she hesitated. The small kitchen under a tin roof, window glass filmed with dust, the rough wooden table darkened by years. No flowers, no cloth, only the bare essentials. Jonas set his hat on the peg, walked in like a man returning to his place. He didn't motion her in, didn't hurry her, didn't steady her step. He left it for Sarah to choose, enter or turn back. She stepped in, her bare feet whispering against the boards. Jonas lit the fire, smoke threading up the chimney like a thin line on the gray sky. He washed beans, dropped them in a pot, added water. The smell of boiling beans rose, plain but warm. On the table, he set before her a bowl of hot soup and a piece of cold cornbread. No explanation, no questioning look. Sarah sat, her hands resting on the coat, still broad on her shoulders, still holding the man's warmth. She stared at the bowl, steam rising, stinging her eyes. It had been a long time since a meal sat before her without prying eyes attached. Jonas pulled a chair and sat across. On the table were only 2 bowls and an oil lamp set to the side, its flame unsteady. They didn't speak, only the faint tap of a spoon against the bowl, the wind slipping through the cracks and stirring the fabric curtain. Sarah lifted the spoon, her lips trembling, then brought it to her mouth with hesitation. The taste was plain, no spice, but the heat sank into her stomach and eased her shoulders a little. Jonas didn't eat. He sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire in the stove. The yellow glow carved the deep lines in his face. His eyes didn't rest on her, didn't demand. They looked through the air, still holding the picture of a past long gone. In the small kitchen, the silence wasn't like the square. Not heavy, not choking. It was like wind across the prairie, dry but breathable. Sarah ate slowly, one hand clutching the coat, eyes glancing at the door from time to time. But then, in a brief moment, she realized no one stood guard, no bolt on the latch. That night, Sarah slept on the hard bed in the small room off the kitchen. The smell of old wood and smoke lingered on the blanket. She lay restless, curled at the edge, the coat around her shoulders like an unwilling armor. Outside, in the other room, the wooden chair creaked when Jonas turned. No footsteps drawing near, no lock sliding in place. Only silence, stretched out like the fields beyond. Sarah sank onto the pillow, eyes open, watching the moonlight slip through the crack of the door. For the first time in months, silence didn't mean shame. It was only a pause, a place to breathe. A nod, a bowl of water set down, and a person relearns what it means to be seen as human. Morning at the ranch began with a rooster beating its wings and the first sunlight sliding through dust-coated windows. Sarah stepped into the yard with tangled hair, bare feet on soil still damp with dew. The wooden chicken coop sagged, hens inside clucking loud for feed. Jonas handed her a tin pail, said nothing more, just gave a short nod. She hesitated, then bent to scatter grain. The flock rushed in, wings flapping, the smell of feathers and dust rising. Sarah coughed softly, but didn't pull back. In the days that followed, one task led into another. Drawing water from the well, carrying it inside, gathering dry wood, stacking it by the stove, forking straw, spreading it in the horse stall. Each time, Jonas stood near, not staring at her, but making sure she knew she wasn't alone. His hand would motion to the bucket or the latch, words used rarely, and she learned to read them. Sarah still startled at the wind banging the door, or hoofbeats sounding from far out. Once, she dropped the water pail, her whole body curling as if waiting for a blow. Jonas only stooped, lifted the bucket, and set it back in her hands. No rebuke, no hard word. A small thing. But inside her, it was strange enough to sting her chest. In the afternoon, when he went out to check the fence line, Sarah followed. She watched the way he struck the posts with his hammer, the way he tied back the wire. Sweat ran down the veins of his sun-darkened arm. He wiped it off quick and kept on. She stood there, fingers worrying at her hem, not much help, but her eyes began to lose their fear. One evening, as the sun went down, she carried a bowl of water out to the porch. He was sitting there, his worn face colored red by the fading light. Sarah set the bowl on the table, said nothing. Jonas glanced once, then gave a nod. Not thanks, but acknowledgement. She was present, and her presence had a place here. Little by little, the turmoil in Sarah's eyes eased. She still looked toward the door often, like someone long used to being driven off, never trusting a place to hold her. But sometimes, when her eyes met Jonas's, she didn't turn away so quick. For a brief moment, the look wasn't fear, it was measuring, and somewhere in it, the faintest edge of trust. One night, with the oil lamp burning low on the table, she saw him fold his old coat slow and hang it on the peg. The same coat he had laid over her shoulders on that day in the square. Sarah sat in the dark, her fingers working the thin fabric of her own dress. For the first time, she didn't feel bare. Not because her clothes were thicker, but because someone had placed something on her shoulders without asking it back. In that plain rhythm of living, piece by piece, the silence became something else, a gentle ground where Sarah could begin to breathe as a person, not as a thing waiting for a price. When the creditors came, there was no gunfire, only a calm sentence. She doesn't belong to you anymore. In small towns, news travels faster than wind. Soon enough, word of Sarah's disappearance from the square drifted through the mouths of drunks at the saloon, carried in market chatter, and landed in the ears of the men she owed. Folks said the girl wasn't in Red Creek anymore, that someone had taken her to a ranch at the end of the slope. One sweltering afternoon, with the sun burning so hard no shadow lay clear on the ground, Jonas was stacking straw at the horse shed when Sarah heard the sound of hoofbeats from afar. At first faint, just a hollow thudding, then sharper, pressing close, like a dry storm rolling in. She lifted her head, hands frozen on the wooden tub, eyes wide. On the trail up to the porch, 3 riders appeared, dust boiling up under their heels. The one in front wore a leather hat, back straight, eyes shining with the kind of authority long used to cowing others. He needed no name. Sarah knew him, knew the way he had once stood on the platform, looking down at her like a piece of stock past its price. Her hand clawed the porch rail, chest tight, breath uneven. Jonas stepped onto the porch, wiping straw from his hands against his trousers. He planted himself between the horses and the girl behind him. No gun drawn, no shout, just a straight-backed figure, still as a timber post, weathered by storms, yet standing. The rider pulled his horse to a stop, a crooked smile on his mouth. His cold eyes swept over Sarah, then back to Jonas. Wind caught strands of her loose hair, showing the tremor she couldn't hide. For a moment, Sarah wanted to slip all the way inside, but her feet rooted hard to the porch boards, as if afraid that one step back would make the shelter vanish. No one spoke, only the creak of leather on saddles, the heavy snort of horses filling the silence. Then, in a voice steady and cold, Jonas said, "Shiloh!" "She doesn't belong to you anymore." No more words, no reason offered. The sentence dropped light as dust, yet heavy enough to split the yard wide. Sarah felt her heart hammering, each beat driving against her ribs as if to break loose. Cold sweat traced down her back, but along with it rose something else, a stunned, bewildered awe. All her life, she had known the silence of others, silence that abandoned, silence that turned away. This was the first time silence had stood between her and the dark. The riders didn't laugh anymore. They glanced at one another, horses tossing their heads, dust still hanging in the air. No gunfire sounded, yet the tension pressed heavier than powder smoke. A long moment stretched like evening shadows dragging across the plain, and then they yanked their reins, turned away, leaving red dust rolling thick across the yard. Sarah stood behind the doorframe, trembling, her hand clawing the wood until it bled. But in her wide eyes, there was something beyond fear. A small, fragile light, kindled from that silence itself. Kindness is not pity. It is the way a man redeems what he has lost. The horse dust settled slow in the sunset. Sarah still stood pressed to the doorframe, her shoulders shaking in waves like a young tree bent by strong wind. In her chest, her heart pounded wild, driving against her ribs as if to break free. Her hand clung hard to the wood, nails dug deep to anchor herself to the present. Jonas did not turn back at once. He stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the trail that had swallowed the rider's whole. His shoulders were broad, steady as a rock weathered through many storms. When the wind pushed past, that back did not move. It only stood, holding the line between her and the world outside. After a long while, he came inside. His eyes were deep, carrying no trace of pride. He set his hat on the wooden peg, as if closing out an ordinary day's work. Sarah looked at him, her throat tight, words rising, but caught fast before they could leave. At last, her voice broke out, shaky but clear. "You didn't have to do that for me." Jonas stopped, not looking straight at her, only gave a small nod, as if hearing something he had long expected. His voice was low and clipped, rough as night wind over the prairie. "I did it for myself." The room went still. The creak of the window ceased. Even the wind outside seemed to fall back. Sarah stood frozen. The fear inside her had been braced for pity, for some hollow comfort, or a possessive gaze. Instead, the answer struck her chest. Kindness was not a favor. It was a way a man redeemed what he had lost. She felt her neck lighten, as though an unseen rope, strung since that day on the scaffold, had been cut away. Her hands unclenched, opened. Tears welled, but not the silent tears of shame. They fell like rare rain on dry land, sudden, brief, yet enough to calm the dust. Jonas sat at the table, poured himself a glass of water. He asked nothing more, pressed for no word. Sarah still stood, her chest racing, yet inside her rose something unfamiliar. She had long been used to bowing her head, dodging eyes, seeing herself as goods past value. Now, for the first time, came a moment that made her want to lift it, not in pride, only to straighten her back enough to breathe. Outside, evening stretched its shadows. Sparrows landed on the barn roof, chirped, and flew again. On the table, the oil lamp had been lit, small but enough to push the darkness back from the corners of the room. Sarah sat, drawing the worn coat close around her shoulders. The warmth in the fabric was no longer someone else's shelter. It was a covering she claimed for herself. In that moment, a thin line was drawn, between fear and hope, between being an object for sale and the presence of a person. And Sarah, though hardly able to believe it, had set her first foot across, to the side of freedom. The first dawn, the girl set down an extra cup of coffee on the porch. A small act, but a declaration of freedom. The night passed slow, like an old man dragging his steps across an empty porch. In the small room off the kitchen, Sarah lay restless. She heard the wind lash against the wooden walls, the call of an owl somewhere on the plain, and the heavy tread of her own thoughts. But this time, fear no longer crushed her. It stepped back a little, leaving space for something gentler, fragile, trembling peace. When the first light broke at the edge of the sky, Sarah rose. She slipped into her thin dress and stepped out onto the porch. Before her, the field lay under a pale silver of mist. In the distance, horses bent to graze, tossing their manes now and then so the dew fell in bright drops. The morning air was still cold, carrying the smell of damp earth and last night's smoke from the stove. Jonas was already there, in the old wooden chair, a cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't look at her, didn't seem surprised. He just sat, as on any morning, eyes set on the horizon brightening by degrees. Sarah moved quietly back into the kitchen, poured another cup, and carried it out. Her hand shook slightly as she placed it on the table beside him. No words, no needless gesture. Jonas glanced over and gave a slight nod. It wasn't just to accept the cup of coffee. It was an acknowledgement that she had crossed some line. No longer a guest taking shelter, but a companion. Sarah sat in the chair beside him. They didn't speak. Only the birdsong far off and the wind moving across the fence. The sun lifted, red as hot coal. Light poured over the field, turning each bead of dew into shards of glass. Sarah raised her head, and for the first time in months, her eyes were not fixed to the ground. She drew a breath, deep, her chest opening. There was no need for promises, no need for a name to this strange bond. In Red Creek, people would whisper stories, add to them or cut them short. But for Sarah, it no longer mattered. In this moment, she sat on the porch, hands around a cup of coffee, eyes on the sunrise. Her shadow and Jonas's stretched side by side across the dirt, reaching all the way to the trail leading back to town. No one knew what the future would bring. But right now, in the silence, Sarah felt the truest kindness one person could give another. Not salvation, not promise, just to stay, to sit beside, and let them lift their face toward the sun. And Red Creek, for the first time in years, had a morning that was not only red dust. It had another silence, one that carried hope.